The night was heavier than usual, as if the air itself carried the weight of countless untold secrets. In a decrepit house at the edge of the city, a solitary figure sat at a cracked window, his tired eyes scanning the moonlit streets below. Time had carved deep lines into his face, but his gaze remained sharp, piercing through the darkness like a man who knew more than he should, like a man who had seen too much. The old man, once a name whispered with reverence in the halls of law enforcement, now lived in the shadows of his past. The city around him had changed. The streets that had once hummed with the promises of justice now echoed with corruption. His days of being a mentor, a guide to the next generation of officers, were long gone. He had once been their teacher, their instructor, the one who shaped the minds of men who would one day hold power over the city. They didn't know it, but their paths were forever intertwined, and they didn't know that yet. His name, once feared, now forgotten, was still remembered by a select few. The chief of police had been one of his best students, the kind of man who had walked into his classroom a boy and left it a soldier. But no one knew how far that training went. They didn't know the depths of what he had taught. They didn't know the lengths to which he had gone to prepare them for the battles they would face. The old man's fingers traced the worn edges of a faded photograph on his desk. It was a picture from a different time, a time when they all believed they were doing good, when they believed the badge was a symbol of honor. He chuckled bitterly to himself. That was before they became the very thing they had sworn to fight against. He knew it. He saw it in their eyes, in the way they looked at him now with distant, indifferent stares. He was just another old man, another forgotten relic of a time when justice had real meaning. But tonight was different. Tonight, something in the air felt charged. The same streets that had once held his promise now brimmed with the very violence and cruelty he had spent years trying to shield the city from. He had watched it unfold in the years since his retirement, watched as the ones he had trained, the ones he had trusted, had taken a darker path. He wasn't ready to forgive, and he wasn't ready to forget. A sharp knock on the door broke the stillness of the room. He stood slowly, every movement deliberate, his aging bones creaking under the weight of years gone by. His heart, however, was still as steady as it had ever been. When he opened the door, he didn't need to ask who was standing on the other side. The tall, imposing figure in front of him wore the same uniform he had once helped tailor to perfection. His former student, the young cop who had risen to power, now wearing the chief's badge. The very man who had once called him Sir, now stood with an air of arrogance that dripped from his every word. "Evening, old man," the chief sneered. His voice was cold, his gaze devoid of any respect. The old man didn't flinch. His gaze remained unwavering, as if looking at the person who stood before him wasn't his former pupil, but just another face in the crowd. "Evening, Chief," he replied, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had lived through more than most would ever know. "What brings you here tonight?" The young man smirked. "Just checking in on the city's most famous retiree. Heard you're living alone, away from all the action. Figured I'd stop by and see if you've got any last-minute advice for me." The old man's eyes flickered for just a moment, a fleeting flash of recognition. But he said nothing. He knew what this was. It wasn't a visit for advice. It was a visit to remind him of his place in a world he no longer fit into. It was the city's way of mocking him. "You know," the chief continued, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "People talk. They say you're just an old fool who doesn't get it anymore. But I'm not one to believe rumors. So, what's your take on the state of things now? You think you still have something to teach me?" The old man closed the door behind him, his face set in an expression of deep contemplation. He knew better than to respond with anger. It wasn't worth it. Instead, he simply watched the chief for a long moment. "I taught you what you needed to know," he said, his voice even, but with a hidden edge. "But it seems you've forgotten some lessons along the way." The chief's face hardened. "I didn't come here to hear about the past. I came here to see if you've got anything left to offer. You think you can still make a difference? You're just a relic now. A memory." The old man's eyes narrowed. "Memories have a way of resurfacing when you least expect it." There was a heavy pause, the air thick with tension. neither man moved. The chief's eyes flickered briefly to the door, as though considering his next words carefully. "I'm not here to listen to your lectures, old man. You were a teacher once. Now, you're just a forgotten footnote, and that's how it's going to stay." The old man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he moved slowly to the table, picking up a small, weathered box. His fingers caressed its surface, as though testing the strength of its hold on the past. Finally he spoke, his voice a whisper, but with the weight of everything that had gone before. "You've forgotten who taught you. You've forgotten what I showed you. But one thing I'll tell you now, never underestimate the past. It has a way of catching up with you." And with that, the tension in the room seemed to double, as if the walls themselves had begun to close in. The young chief's arrogance faltered, a subtle crack appearing in his otherwise confident facade. The old man's words weren't a warning, they were a promise, and the city would soon learn, along with him, that some lessons never fade. The night dragged on, thick with an oppressive weight that clung to the city like a fog, suffocating its life. The old man, now alone in his dimly lit room, could still feel the presence of the chief lingering in the air. The arrogance had slipped from the chief's voice, but the malice had remained. He could hear the echoes of their conversation reverberating in his mind, each word like a knife twisting deeper into an already well-worn wound. The truth, unspoken but undeniable, hung between them. The old man wasn't naive. He knew what had happened to the ones he had mentored. The system they had once pledged to fight against had infected them, hollowing them out from the inside. They had become the very thing they swore to dismantle, their ideals twisted into something grotesque. The chief, once an idealistic young man, had climbed the ranks, his ambition feeding on the suffering of others. The city had changed, but so had he. The years had hardened him, but they hadn't broken him. Not yet. The sun had barely risen when he left the house the next morning. The streets, now drenched in the grey light of dawn, offered a stark contrast to the man who walked through them. He moved through the alleys and shadows, a ghost among the living, unnoticed by the crowds, invisible to the world that had left him behind. But he was watching them all, his eyes sharp, taking in every detail, every whisper of movement around him. The streets were filled with people, but it was the cops who caught his attention. They were everywhere, their uniforms unmistakable, their stares cold and full of judgment. They moved in groups, laughing, mocking, their very presence an embodiment of control and power. The old man knew what they did when they thought no one was looking. He had seen them hurt people, humiliate them, degrade them in ways that were far more damaging than any bullet or fist. They would strike when their victims were at their most vulnerable, an old woman trying to cross the street, a young man standing too close to a corner, a mother looking for a way to protect her child. It didn't matter who they hurt, as long as they could maintain their dominance, their superiority. It was a game to them, one they played with ease, their actions rooted in the deep-seated racism and prejudice that ran like poison through their veins. The old man had witnessed it firsthand, had tried to warn them, to show them the error of their ways. But now he realized his warnings had fallen on deaf ears. They no longer cared about justice, they cared about power. And today, it was about to come full circle. The old man had his eyes set on one particular street, a place where he knew they would gather. The underbelly of the city, where the unspeakable things took place, where the divide between the haves and the have-nots was most evident. He had trained many of these men, had taught them to follow the law, to respect the people they were sworn to protect. But somewhere along the line, they had stopped listening to him. As he walked through the neighborhood, he could feel the tension building. He had become a phantom of the past, and yet the memories of what he had once stood for, what he had once hoped to build, were still alive within him. Those same memories, however, were now stained with the ugliness of what had become of his former students. He reached the corner and saw them, the cops, grouped together, their laughter carrying through the streets. They were a pack of wolves circling their prey. One officer in particular, tall and broad-shouldered, stood at the center of the group, his uniform crisp and neat. It was the chief, though the old man could hardly recognize him in this moment. He had become the very thing he had once warned against. The old man stood still, watching from a distance. He could hear their conversation now, and it made his blood boil. "Man, it's always the same with these people," one officer sneered, his words dripping with disdain. "You let them have an inch, and they think they own the whole damn block." The others laughed, a collective mocking sound that echoed down the street. "It's the way they are, man," another cop added. "They don't know their place, always causing trouble, always making excuses for their own failures." The chief smirked. "You're not wrong. Some people just don't get it. They think they're entitled to respect, but they haven't earned it." The old man's fists clenched at his sides, his knuckles white against the skin. He had heard these words before, in darker places, from darker people, but hearing it from the ones he had trained, the ones he had trusted, felt like a betrayal too deep to comprehend. They weren't just mocking the people they were sworn to protect, they were mocking him, his lessons, and the very principles that had once guided their every decision. It was in that moment that he made up his mind. He had given them all the chances he could. Now it was time to make them pay for what they had become. He moved swiftly, his old legs carrying him with purpose. He knew where they would be going. There was a liquor store just a few blocks away, a place that had become their regular haunt after their shifts. It was the perfect place for the kind of recklessness they displayed, a place where the city's darker side could rear its head without consequence. The old man arrived just as they were entering. He could see the way the people around them reacted, some of them avoiding eye contact, others making hurried steps to cross the street. He had seen it all before, the way the public feared them, the way they feared anyone who wore a uniform. He stepped into the store behind them, unnoticed at first. The clerk, a young woman with tired eyes, barely looked up from her work as they entered. They didn't even acknowledge her existence, their voices booming as they joked about the people they had humiliated earlier that day. "Man, that old lady didn't even know what hit her," one of them laughed. "She was practically begging us to help her. Pathetic." "Yeah, she's lucky we let her go. Most people wouldn't get that kind of mercy," the chief added, his voice dripping with condescension. The old man's breath caught in his throat. He could feel the blood rushing to his head, his pulse quickening. They weren't just being cruel. They were enjoying it. The officers were drunk on their own power, their privilege. They had become monsters in uniforms, their once innocent faces now twisted with contempt for the very people they had sworn to protect. He took a step forward, his presence finally catching their attention. The chief turned, his face lighting up in recognition. Well, 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 if it isn't the old man," the chief said with a smirk, his tone mocking. "You still hanging around here watching us?" The old man's voice was low, steady, but filled with a sharp edge. "I'm not here to watch. I'm here to remind you of who you used to be." The chief's smile faltered for just a second. "What are you talking about? You're nothing now, just a relic of the past." But the old man was already moving. He walked up to the counter, staring directly into the eyes of the officer who had mocked the old lady. "You're all the same," he said softly. "You think because you wear a badge, because you have power, that you can do whatever you want. You think that makes you better than the people you're supposed to protect." The officer's expression darkened. "Watch your mouth, old man." The old man leaned in, his voice colder than ice. "You don't get to tell me what to do. You don't get to disrespect the people who trust you. You don't get to think you can erase the lessons I taught you." There was a tense silence. The young officer looked at the chief, as if seeking permission. But the chief only nodded, his face a mask of cold indifference. "You're out of line," the chief said, his voice now taking on a dangerous edge, "and I think it's time for you to leave." But the old man wasn't finished. "You're no better than the criminals you arrest. You've become what you once swore to fight." The room grew colder. The clerk had stopped what she was doing, watching the exchange unfold in front of her. She could feel the tension building, the way the room seemed to shrink with every word that passed between them. It wasn't just a confrontation, it was a battle for something much deeper, for respect, for power, for the truth, and for the first time in years, the old man felt alive. Let's take a brief pause here. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening to our stories from? Have you ever experienced something similar in your life? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more. Now, let's continue. The tension in the store hung thick, suffocating. The old man, standing now in the dim light, was acutely aware of the space between him and the officers. Every inch was charged with a palpable force. The harsh fluorescent lights above flickered as though they too were aware of the storm that was about to unfold. The young cop, who had earlier mocked the elderly woman, shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable under the old man's unwavering stare. The clerk stood frozen, unsure of what to do, but her eyes darted nervously between the old man and the officers. It was the same fear that had pervaded this city for years. The fear of speaking up, of challenging the very men who were meant to protect and serve. The fear of becoming another victim. The chief took a slow step forward, his jaw tightening, his eyes narrowing. "You don't know who you're talking to," he said, his voice low but seething. "This is my city now, my people." The old man stood his ground, his weathered face as impassive as ever. "Your people, the people you demean and break, the people who fear you like you're some kind of god." The chief's lip curled in contempt. "You're just an old man. You don't understand how the world works anymore. People like you are a thing of the past." The words hit the old man like a slap. He had heard those same words too many times before, from those who had been too blind, too consumed by their own power, to realize the harm they were doing. He could see it now in the chief's eyes. The arrogance, the pride, the belief that he was untouchable. They thought they were invincible, protected by the badge, by their status. They had forgotten what it meant to truly serve. "I understand far more than you think," the old man said softly, the words cutting through the air like a knife. "I taught you how to do this job, how to stand for something, but you lost your way. You became something ugly, something that doesn't belong in this city." The room grew silent, the weight of the old man's words hanging in the air. The officers, most of them standing behind the chief, shifted uncomfortably. It was evident in the way they avoided eye contact, in the way their hands twitched by their sides, ready to reach for their weapons if necessary. But they knew better. Something about this encounter felt different. There was more at stake here than just a confrontation. "You think you know me?" the chief sneered. "You think you've got the right to lecture me? You don't get it, old man. This city isn't about honor anymore. It's about control. It's about power." The old man's eyes never left the chief's, but his voice, when he spoke, was calm. Too calm. "And it's about fear, isn't it? You hold your badge up like a shield, but what it really does is protect you from the consequences of your own actions. You can do whatever you want, and no one dares to stop you." The chief's face reddened with rage, his fists clenching at his sides. "You've lost your place in this world. It's time for you to go." A slight, almost imperceptible chuckle escaped the old man's lips. "You really don't get it. The world is changing, Chief. You might think you've won, but this is just the beginning." Without another word, the old man turned, walking calmly toward the door. The tension in the room lingered, the officers frozen in place, unsure of what to do. But the chief's voice followed him. "Don't think you can get away with this," the chief warned, his voice barely a whisper. "You'll regret it." The old man didn't stop. He didn't flinch. He walked out the door without even looking back, as though he knew something the others didn't. Something that would bring them all crashing down. Batrap matitro. As he stepped out onto the sidewalk, the cool air hit his face, but he didn't feel the chill. His mind was focused on what had to come next. He had played his part. He had provoked the chief, made him feel something he hadn't felt in years. doubt. The seed had been planted. Now it was only a matter of time before the truth began to unfold. The streets were alive with the usual hum of the city, but there was something different today. It was as if the people themselves could sense the shift in the air, the impending storm. The old man knew it wasn't just the chief who had lost his way, it was the entire system. The corruption that had festered within the ranks of law enforcement had grown like a cancer, spreading to every corner of the city. It wasn't just about the officers anymore. It was about the culture they had built, the mindset that had taken root and thrived. He had been a part of it once. He had been part of the system that had allowed this rot to take hold. He had been naive enough to believe that he could change things, to believe that by teaching the next generation of officers, he could make a difference. But the truth was undeniable now. They were beyond saving. He had to be the one to tear it all down. Later that evening, the old man sat in his small apartment, the only light coming from a single lamp that cast long, haunting shadows across the room. His mind raced with the events of the day. He thought about the chief, about how the young man had grown into someone unrecognizable. But there were others too. The officers he had taught, the ones who had once looked up to him. They had all turned. And then there were the ones who remained loyal, those who had stayed true to the principles he had instilled in them. They were scattered across the city now, fighting their own battles, struggling to hold on to their integrity in a world that demanded they abandon it. But the system had a way of finding those who resisted. It always had. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. The old man rose slowly, his body protesting with every movement. He wasn't as spry as he used to be, but his mind was sharp, his senses honed. He opened the door to find a familiar face standing on the other side, one of his former students. "Sir," the officer said, his voice low, almost apologetic. "I heard what happened today. I need to talk to you." The old man stepped aside, motioning for him to enter. "Come in," he said quietly. "I was wondering when you would show up." The officer stepped inside, glancing nervously around the room. He was young, still in his 20s, but there was a weariness in his eyes, a haunted look that came from seeing too much too soon. He had been one of the good ones, or so the old man had thought. But even the best of them had their breaking points. "You were right," the officer said, his voice trembling. "I've seen it now. I've seen what they're doing, what he's doing." The old man nodded slowly. "It's a hard thing to realize, isn't it?" "I thought it was all for the greater good," the officer continued. "I thought we were making a difference, but now I see that we're just part of the problem." The old man sat down across from him, his eyes steady. "It's not too late to change, but you have to decide what kind of man you want to be." The officer looked down at his hands, as though weighing the words carefully. "I want to do what's right, but I don't know if I can. The system, it's too powerful. And if I speak out..." The old man leaned forward, his voice low but resolute. "If you don't speak out, you're complicit. Don't let fear keep you silent. This is your chance to be more than just another cog in the machine." The officer's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know if I'm strong enough." The old man placed a hand on his shoulder. "You are, but you won't know until you try." The room was silent for a long moment, the weight of the decision settling heavily on both of them. Outside, the city seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the storm that was sure to come. And in that moment, the old man knew. This was just the beginning of the end. The city seemed quieter than usual in the days that followed. The streets were still filled with people, with the usual sounds of life, cars honking, children laughing, street vendors calling out their wares. But there was a subtle undercurrent, a tension that had settled in the air. The old man could feel it. It wasn't just the palpable sense of fear that had hung over the city for years. It was something more. The kind of unease that crept into the bones of a place, signaling a shift, a rupture in the balance of things. The encounter at the liquor store hadn't been just another confrontation. It had been a spark, a moment of reckoning. The old man had planted the seed, and he knew that in time it would grow. The chief, still unaware of the consequences that would come from their exchange, was too caught up in his own delusions of power to see the storm brewing just beneath the surface. But the old man had seen it coming. He had always known that the city's power was built on a fragile foundation, one that could crumble with the right push. The officer who had come to visit him, the young man who had once looked up to him with such admiration, had left with a heavy heart, but also a new sense of clarity. The old man had given him the courage to see the truth, the system, the badge, the promises they had all been taught to believe in. None of it had been what they thought it was. It had all been a lie, and now the young officer had to make a choice: to stay silent, to continue down the path of complicity, or to take a stand and fight for something real. The old man had made his choice long ago. In the days that followed, the old man did what he had always done. He moved through the city like a ghost, watching, listening, waiting. He knew the chief's routine by heart. He knew when he would be at the precinct, when he would be out on patrol, and when he would be at his favorite bar, drowning his sorrows. The old man had always been good at observing people, at reading them, and it had been this skill that had made him such a formidable force in his prime. Now, it made him a patient one. He had to be careful. The chief was dangerous, but not in the way most people thought. He wasn't a brute. He wasn't the kind of man who would snap and lash out in blind fury. No, the chief was more calculated than that. He was the kind of man who would wait, who would bide his time, and then strike when it was least expected. That made him even more dangerous. The first sign that things were beginning to change came late one night. The old man was walking through the alleys of the city when he saw the young officer again, the one who had visited him. This time, however, the officer wasn't alone. He was walking with a group of other officers, all of them laughing, joking. They were talking about their day, about the arrests they'd made, about the people they'd put behind bars. But the old man could see the difference in the officers' eyes. They weren't filled with the same pride that had once burned in them. There was something darker there now, something that told the old man that the young officer had started to see the truth. As the group walked past him, the old man stepped into their path, blocking their way. The young officer stopped in his tracks, his eyes locking with the old man's. The others fell silent, sensing the tension in the air. The officer hesitated before speaking. "What are you doing here, old man?" The old man's eyes were sharp as ever. "I'm not here for you. I'm here for what you represent. You've seen it now, haven't you? The lies, the corruption, the racism that runs through every part of this city, every part of the force." The officer's face flushed with discomfort, but he didn't look away. "I'm not part of that. I'm not like the others." The old man's gaze softened, but only slightly. "You're not like the others, but you're still one of them. You wear the same uniform, the same badge. You stand by and watch as they do what they do. You may not be part of the problem, but you're complicit in it." The officer clenched his fists, his jaw tight. "What do you expect me to do about it?" The old man took a step closer, lowering his voice. "You have a choice. You can keep pretending that everything's fine, that this is how things are supposed to be. Or you can take a stand. You can choose to be part of the solution instead of the problem." The officer looked away, conflicted, unsure of what to do. The others were watching now, waiting for him to respond. But the old man could see the storm brewing inside the officer. He was torn between loyalty to his fellow officers and his growing disgust with what they represented. The old man wasn't going to let him off the hook. He stepped forward again, his voice firm. "You're not the only one who's watched this happen, but you might be the only one left who has the chance to change it." The officer didn't say anything for a long moment. Finally, he looked up, meeting the old man's gaze once more. "I'll think about it," he said quietly. The old man nodded. "Don't think too long." And with that, the group of officers continued on their way, leaving the old man standing alone in the darkened street. his heart heavy, but his resolve stronger than ever. On the next few days were tense. The old man could feel the ripple effect of his encounter with the officer. The young man was still struggling with the weight of the truth, but he was no longer the same as he had been before. He had started to question everything: the system, the badge, the very foundations on which his career had been built. But the chief, the man who had once been his student, had other plans. He was still playing his game, moving his pieces across the board like a puppet master, unaware that his strings were beginning to unravel. The chief had always been a man who thrived on power, on control. He believed the city belonged to him, that it was his to mold, to shape as he saw fit. But what he didn't realize was that he had created his own prison. The more he pushed, the more he isolated himself. The cracks in his carefully constructed world were becoming impossible to ignore. The old man knew that the chief would never give up his power willingly, and so he began to make his move. The first step was to reach out to those who still held some sense of loyalty, those who had once believed in justice, who had once trusted the system. He knew they were still out there, scattered throughout the city, working in the shadows, trying to make a difference in a place that had long since stopped caring. The old man began meeting with them in secret, talking to those who were still willing to fight. He couldn't do it alone. He needed allies, people who were willing to stand with him, people who weren't afraid to take on the system from within. Together, they began to form a plan. It wasn't going to be easy. It was going to take time, patience, and a great deal of courage. But the old man had seen how things worked before. He knew that the system wasn't invincible. It could be broken. The chief's arrogance had blinded him. He had become so convinced of his own superiority that he couldn't see the people turning against him. The city, once under his thumb, was starting to slip from his grasp. The old man could feel it in the air. The ground was shifting beneath their feet. The storm was coming, and this time it would be different. The days were growing darker, both in the literal sense and for the city that had long suffered under the heavy hand of corruption. The old man knew this was the point of no return, the moment where everything would either collapse or explode. His years of teaching, of fighting the system from within, had led him to this singular moment. And now, with the chief's hold on the city beginning to slip, the tension was palpable. The people were beginning to stir, their murmurs of discontent spreading like wildfire. The officers on the force who had quietly shared their grievances, those who had once been the hope of the city, now found themselves questioning everything they had sworn to uphold. The old man could feel the shift in the air. It was as if the entire city was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable collision. But as the cracks in the system began to appear, the chief's response was swift and brutal. He had never been a man to let his power slip away without a fight, and he was prepared to do whatever it took to keep control. It didn't matter who he had to step on, who he had to crush. His pride, his need to be the unquestioned ruler, had long since overtaken any sense of justice or morality. It was late one night when the old man received the call, the kind of call that he had known was coming, but still, it struck him like a blow to the chest. The young officer, the one who had sought his counsel, had been found dead. The news spread quickly, though the details remained murky at best. There were whispers, rumors, that he had committed suicide, but the old man didn't buy it. The officer had been the future. He had been a symbol of hope, of the possibility that things could change. But the chief, the system, had seen him as a threat, and threats were never tolerated. The old man knew he couldn't let this go. He couldn't allow the chief to bury the truth. He had seen it too many times. People like the chief used fear, used death, as a tool to maintain control. But this was different. This officer had been his student, his protégé. He had helped raise him, guided him through the same struggles he had faced. And now, that same system had taken him down. The old man's heart hardened as he made the decision. He would not let this man's death be in vain. The time for waiting was over. At Tseyuwanam he moved quickly, gathering his allies from the shadows. They were a small group, but they were the right people, the ones who had never given up on the ideals that had once driven the force. They were disillusioned, yes, but they had not completely lost their humanity. It was these officers, these men and women who still believed in justice, who were the key. Together, they would dismantle the system from the inside. The old man knew the chief would come for him next. He could feel the eyes on him, the sense of impending danger that came with being too close to the truth. But he had no intention of hiding. He was done being the silent observer. It was time to expose the chief for what he truly was. The night of the officer's funeral was when everything began to unfold. It was a cold, silent evening, the kind of night where even the moon seemed reluctant to cast its light. The old man stood at the back of the crowd, watching as the chief stood near the front, his face a mask of false solemnity. The irony wasn't lost on the old man. Here was a man who had no genuine care for the officer, no real grief in his heart, yet here he was, playing the part of the mourner. The old man's eyes narrowed as he watched the chief interact with the other officers. His posture was stiff, his gestures exaggerated, as if he were putting on a show. He was playing the part of the leader, the protector, but everyone knew it was all a lie. The people could feel it, the officers could see it. His grip on the city was slipping, and he knew it. But instead of showing humility, instead of taking responsibility for the corruption that had festered under his watch, the chief stood taller, more defiant than ever. He was making his move now, an arrogant statement of power in the face of tragedy. But the old man knew better than to fall for it. He had seen this game before. He had been part of it. And now, he would tear it apart. As the service concluded, the chief and his officers made their way to their cars, their conversations low, almost conspiratorial. The old man moved quickly, slipping through the crowd, his steps deliberate. He had already made his plan. He knew where the chief would be heading, where he would take refuge after the public display of faux grief. The chief didn't see it coming, not at first. He didn't notice the old man shadowing him, following him from the church to a nearby alley where the chief planned to meet with a few of his trusted officers. The old man had anticipated every move, every step, because he knew how the chief thought. He knew what made him tick, but what the chief didn't know was that the old man had one final lesson to impart, a lesson that would leave a permanent mark on him, on the system, and on the city. The alley was dark, lit only by the flickering glow of a street lamp at the far end. The chief entered, his posture now more relaxed, thinking he had escaped the prying eyes of the public. The old man followed, his footsteps barely audible against the cold concrete. He waited, hidden in the shadows, watching as the chief met with his officers. They spoke in hushed tones, but the old man could hear enough. He heard the contempt in their voices, the way they mocked the very people they had sworn to protect. He heard the racial slurs, the insults thrown at the city's most vulnerable residents. They didn't see them as people. They didn't care about justice. They cared about power, about domination, and they would do anything to maintain it. "Those people don't belong here," one of the officers said, his voice full of venom. "They're nothing but a drain on the city. They're not worth saving." The chief's voice, cold and calculating, replied, "Don't worry. They'll never rise up against us. They're too weak. They'll never see it coming." The old man's blood ran cold. It wasn't just about control anymore. It wasn't just about enforcing the law. This was about something far darker, about the belief that some people didn't deserve to be protected, that they were beneath the officer's notice. It was a belief rooted in deep-seated racism, a belief that had poisoned every part of the system, and it was time to tear it down. The old man stepped forward, his presence breaking through the tension in the alley like a sharp blade. He had heard enough. He had seen enough. "You really think they'll never rise up?" he called out, his voice steady, his every word dripping with contempt. The chief froze, his eyes snapping to the old man. "You," he sneered. "You should have stayed out of this. You don't belong here anymore." "I belong here more than you ever will," the old man shot back, his voice cutting through the air with precision. You've forgotten who you are, what you were supposed to be. You've become everything you swore to fight against. The officers around the chief bristled, but none of them made a move. They were all too aware of the power the old man still commanded, the legacy he carried. But the chief was different. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't going to back down. "You think you can stop me?" the chief said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "You're just an old man. You have nothing left." The old man's eyes locked with his gaze fierce and unyielding. "You think you're untouchable, don't you? You think you've won. But I'm here to tell you that it's over." The chief's smirk faltered, but only for a moment. He stepped forward, his hand resting on the gun at his side. "It's not over until I say it is." The old man's voice remained calm, but his words carried the weight of truth. "You've already lost. You just don't know it yet." The tension in the air was unbearable. The city was on the edge of a precipice, and everything that had been building for years was about to come to a head. And then, as if on cue, the sound of sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder, closer. It was the sound of change, of revolution, of everything finally coming to a head. The old man had set his plan into motion, and now it was too late for the chief to stop it. "Ma'am, sir, ow." As the chief turned, his face twisted with rage. The old man knew this was it. The end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The city was no longer under the chief's control. The truth was out, and the old man had finally done what he had promised all those years ago. He had made sure the system was brought down, piece by piece. It was only a matter of time now. The city was on the brink, teetering between chaos and the possibility of something better. The old man could feel it in the air. The events of the past few days had set in motion a chain of reactions, ripples that were impossible to stop. But it wasn't just the officers or the chief who were under scrutiny anymore. It was the entire system, the fabric of power that had been woven into every corner of the city. And for the first time in years, people were questioning it. People were rising up. It had begun with whispers. Then it became more than whispers. The people who had lived under the thumb of the system, who had been crushed by the weight of inequality and injustice, were no longer willing to remain silent. They had watched as their voices were ignored, their pleas for change dismissed as irrelevant. But now, something had shifted. They could feel the momentum, the groundswell of support from every corner. It wasn't just the marginalized anymore. It was everyone. The old man, sitting in his dimly lit apartment, watched the news on the screen in front of him. The city was alive with protests, the streets filled with people demanding change. It wasn't just about the police anymore. It was about the broader system that had allowed corruption to fester unchecked for so long. The chief's hold on the city had slipped beyond repair, and the consequences were beginning to unfold. He had done what he needed to do. His actions, his words, had planted the seed of doubt in the minds of those who could change things. The officer who had died was the catalyst, the one who had seen the corruption, who had been willing to speak up. His death, whether by his own hand or someone else's, had sparked a fire that could no longer be extinguished. The truth was coming to light, and with it came the reckoning. The old man had spent decades trying to fix the system from the inside, but he had come to realize that it was beyond repair. The rot had spread too deep. It wasn't just about the actions of a few corrupt officers. It was about the mindset, the culture that permeated the entire institution. It was about the belief that power could be used to control, to dominate, to oppress. But that was changing. The people in the streets, the ones who had been suffering for far too long, were no longer afraid. They had found their voice, and it was louder than ever. The old man's mind wandered to the young officer, the one who had sought his counsel, the one who had seen the truth for what it was. He hadn't heard from him in days. The officer had been in turmoil after the death of his fellow officer, but the old man knew that he wasn't the kind of person to back down. He would have made his choice by now, one way or another. Either he would stand with the system, or he would stand against it. He grabbed his coat and left the apartment. The city had changed, but it was still his home. He couldn't sit idly by while the people fought for their right to be heard. It was time to meet with those who had come to his side, those who believed that change was possible. The meeting took place in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, far from the prying eyes of those who would stop them before they had a chance to act. The old man arrived early, the heavy footsteps of his boots echoing off the cracked concrete floor as he surveyed the room. It was a makeshift space, but it was perfect for their purposes: private, secluded, and most importantly, neutral ground. He wasn't the only one there. The officers who had once looked up to him, who had served with him, had gathered as well. They had all seen the truth in their own ways, had all reached the point where the system's corruption was undeniable. Some of them had been part of the very system that had failed the city, but they were ready to make amends. They were ready to stand for what was right. The old man moved toward the center of the room, where a large table had been set up. Maps of the city were scattered across the surface, with markers indicating key locations: precincts, police stations, city hall. The pieces were being moved into place. It was time to take action. He could feel the weight of the decision, but he knew it was the only way forward. He didn't have much time. The chief would be mobilizing his forces soon, trying to regain control, to suppress the protests. But the old man knew that this wasn't about just the police anymore. It was about the people reclaiming their city, their power. It was about showing the world that the system could no longer dictate the terms of their lives. The officers gathered around the table, looking at him with a mix of respect and determination. They were nervous, yes. There was fear in their eyes, but it wasn't fear of the chief. It was the fear of change, of doing something they had never done before, something they had been taught to avoid at all costs. "The time for waiting is over," the old man said, his voice steady. "The city is already in motion. We can't stop it now, but we can guide it. We can make sure that what comes next is not another cycle of violence, of repression, but a real change. A change that comes from the people, from the heart of the city." One of the officers spoke up. "But what if they come for us? The chief, the others, they won't just let this go. They'll come down hard." The old man's eyes met his, a silent understanding passing between them. "They will, but we've already seen their cards. They'll use fear, they'll use force, but they won't win. The people won't let them." Another officer, a woman who had been with the force for years, nodded. "We're with you. But how do we make sure this isn't just a moment? How do we make sure this isn't just another protest, another march that fades into nothing?" The old man looked around the room, meeting each officer's eyes in turn. "We build a foundation. We stand with the people, not above them. We use our knowledge, our experience, to show them how to navigate this system, how to hold those in power accountable. We become their allies, their protectors." The room fell silent as they absorbed his words. This wasn't just about fighting the chief. It was about creating something better, something more just. It was about tearing down the walls that had kept the people separated from the power that rightfully belonged to them. As the meeting continued, the old man felt the weight of the city on his shoulders. But he also felt something else: hope. It was small, fragile, but it was there. He had spent so many years watching the system grind people down, watching as the voices of the oppressed were silenced. But now, for the first time, he saw a real chance for change. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight. But it was possible. He turned back to the map, marking a few key locations. "This is where we make our stand," he said, his voice firm. "We begin with the precincts, the places where the corruption runs deepest. We expose the truth and we protect those who are standing with us. We take this city back." The officers nodded in agreement, their faces set with determination. They knew the risks. They knew what would happen if they failed. But they also knew that they couldn't remain silent any longer. The people were ready for change, and so were they. The old man left the warehouse, his heart heavy, but his mind clear. The city was awake now. It was alive with the possibility of something better. It would take time. It would take sacrifice. But for the first time in years, he felt like there was hope on the horizon. The chief would not go down quietly. He would resist. He would fight back. But the old man had seen enough to know that this time, the people had the power. They had the truth on their side. And in the end, that would be enough. The reckoning had begun. And it would not stop until justice had been done. The air in the city had thickened. It wasn't just the smoke from the fires of the protests or the heavy fog that rolled in every morning. It was something far more insidious. Something that weighed on the hearts of everyone who lived here. It was the feeling that things were finally, undeniably shifting. People were no longer afraid to stand up, to demand justice. It was a storm that had been brewing for years, and now it was breaking. The old man stood on the rooftop of an abandoned building, watching as the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting a reddish hue across the skyline. The streets were alive with movement, protests, marches, and demonstrations. But this was different. This wasn't just a reaction to injustice anymore. It was the beginning of a new chapter, a new era. The people had seen the cracks in the system, and now they were ready to tear it apart. Below, he could see his allies moving through the crowd, officers, activists, ordinary citizens who had all come together for one purpose, to make sure that the city would never be the same again. They had one common goal, and it was clear from the looks on their faces that they were ready to fight for it. This wasn't just about taking down the chief anymore. This was about reshaping the future, about rebuilding a city from the ground up. The old man had watched the corruption of the system spread like a cancer for years. He had seen officers become numb to the suffering around them, to the injustices that were being carried out in their name. But he had also seen the spark of hope, the small group of people who still believed that change was possible. And now, that group had grown. It had become a movement, one that was impossible to ignore. But even as the momentum built, there was a deep, underlying tension. The city was on the brink. The chief, cornered and desperate, was ready to lash out. He had always been a man of control, a man who believed that power was his to wield as he saw fit. But now, even he could sense that his grip on the city was slipping. And desperate men, like desperate animals, were the most dangerous. Inside the headquarters of the police precinct, the chief paced back and forth, his face twisted in a mask of fury and frustration. He had never felt so vulnerable. For years, he had ruled the city with an iron fist, his authority unquestioned. But now, even his closest allies were turning against him. The corruption, the brutality, everything he had done to maintain power, it was all coming to light, and the people were no longer afraid. "Where the hell is my backup?" the chief snapped, slamming his fist on the desk. "Why are they just sitting there? They should be shutting this down. These animals should be scared." "We are the law, damn it!" His voice echoed through the empty office, his words fueled by a combination of fear and rage. The walls around him felt like they were closing in. He had always relied on fear, fear of the badge, fear of the system, fear of the power that came with it. But that fear was fading, slipping away like sand through his fingers. One of his officers, a tall man with a hard expression, stepped forward. "Sir, we've been receiving reports that some of the officers are not willing to support us. Some of them are joining the protesters, or at least staying neutral." The chief's eyes narrowed. "What? Are you telling me that they are betraying me?" "I don't know if it's betrayal, sir, but there are rumors. People are starting to question the way things have been done. They're seeing the truth, and they don't like what they're seeing." The chief's face contorted in fury. "Truth? There is no truth but the one I create. I hold this city together. Without me, it falls apart. And now they want to tear it all down? Over what? Some damn protests." The officer didn't respond, but the silence between them spoke volumes. The chief's power was slipping, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Outside the precinct, the city had reached its boiling point. The protests had grown larger, more organized. People from all walks of life had come together, united in their desire for justice, for accountability. It was a sight to behold, a citywide cry for change, a collective voice that could no longer be ignored. The old man walked through the crowd, his eyes scanning the faces of the people around him. He saw anger, yes, but he also saw something else. Hope. The kind of hope that came from the knowledge that they were not alone, that they had the power to make a difference. He had seen many movements fail, crushed under the weight of corruption and indifference. But this time, it was different. This time, the people had the courage to fight back. He stopped in front of a group of young activists, their faces painted with determination. "Are we ready?" he asked, his voice steady. One of the young women turned to him, her eyes fierce. "We've been ready. We're not stopping until they hear us, until we take back what's ours." The old man nodded, his heart swelling with pride. These were the ones who would change the future, not him, not the broken system he had fought so hard to change. It was the new generation that would carry the torch forward. They were ready to rebuild. But it wasn't just about what was happening in the streets. The true battle was taking place in the shadows, within the very institutions that had been corrupted over time. The chief's allies were scattered, but they weren't gone. They were biding their time, preparing to strike when the opportunity presented itself. The old man knew that the fight was far from over. This was just the beginning. The people were rising, but the chief and his inner circle would not give up without a fight. They would try to crush the movement. They would try to stop the truth from coming to light. Shamru. The old man's thoughts were interrupted by a sharp noise. Siren wails echoed through the air, signaling a change in the atmosphere. The police were preparing to take action. But this time, things were different. The people were no longer afraid. They had been pushed too far, and now they were ready to fight back. He turned to the young activists. "This is it. They'll try to break us. They'll use force. They'll use fear. But we don't back down. We stand together. We stand strong." The woman nodded. "We've been waiting for this moment. The people are with us. They won't let us fail." The air grew tense as the sounds of footsteps grew louder. Officers were marching toward them, their uniforms standing in stark contrast to the peaceful faces of the protesters. The old man could feel the weight of the moment, the energy in the air. The battle had arrived, and this time, it wouldn't end the way it had before. Pram. As the first clash between protesters and police broke out in the street, the city seemed to hold its breath. The old man moved through the crowd, watching as the officers hesitated, unsure of where their loyalty truly lay. He could see the fear in their eyes, the doubt that had begun to creep in. They had been raised to believe in the system, to follow orders without question. But now, they were beginning to see the truth, and truth, once seen, could never be unseen. The old man knew this was the turning point. This was the moment that would determine the future of the city. Would the system continue to dominate? Would the chief maintain control? Or would the people rise up and demand the change they so desperately needed? It was a question that would soon be answered. But the old man knew one thing for certain. The battle for the soul of the city had only just begun. The reckoning was upon them, and the old man was ready to face whatever came next. The city had reached its boiling point. For days, the streets had been filled with protests, demands for justice ringing through the air. The old man had witnessed the gradual transformation of the city around him, from a place plagued by corruption and fear, to one where the people were beginning to find their voice. But as the struggle intensified, the reality of what was at stake became clearer. The chief, cornered and desperate, was no longer the calm, calculating figure who had ruled with an iron fist. He had become a man driven by fear and pride, his every action a reaction to losing control. The people had been rising for days, their marches and protests only growing in number and fervour. What began as a series of isolated clashes between police and protesters had become a full-scale rebellion against the status quo. The old man had helped lead the charge, his influence among the people growing as they began to realize that the battle was not only about the chief, but about the system that had allowed men like him to flourish unchecked. But with every action, there was a counteraction. The city had become a powder keg, and the chief, in his desperation to maintain power, had made his first fatal mistake, underestimating the people he thought he could control. He had relied on fear for too long, but fear was no longer enough. The old man stood outside the precinct, watching the chaos unfold. The sound of chanting voices echoed in the streets as a sea of protesters gathered outside the doors of the building, their collective roar impossible to ignore. The chief and his men had fortified themselves inside, but the barricades they had set up couldn't hold forever. Every minute that passed only added fuel to the fire. The old man could see the tension in the faces of the officers who stood within the precinct. They were trapped between two worlds, loyal to the badge they had once sworn to uphold, but now uncertain of whether that allegiance was worth the cost. The movement had gained momentum, and it wasn't just the protesters on the streets who wanted change. Some of the officers, those who had grown disillusioned with the corruption and brutality of the force, were quietly siding with the people. The chief had underestimated how deeply the rot had spread within his own ranks. In the distance, the sound of approaching sirens rang through the air, signaling the arrival of reinforcements. But the old man knew that reinforcements wouldn't be enough. The people had spoken, and they would not be silenced. The struggle for the soul of the city had reached its climax. Inside the precinct, the chief was pacing, his mind racing. The walls felt as if they were closing in on him. His officers had begun to question his authority, his loyalty, and every decision he had made up until that point. His grip on the city was slipping, and with each passing moment, it seemed more and more likely that he would lose everything. The officer who had been the first to speak out, the one who had come to the old man for advice, had been absent from his post for days. The chief knew that the officer's silence was no coincidence. It was a sign that the cracks within the force had widened, and the loyalty he once commanded was beginning to unravel. "What do we do now?" the chief asked, his voice trembling with uncertainty. "How do we stop this?" One of the senior officers, a man whose face had long been hardened by the violence he had witnessed, spoke up. "We hold the line. We hold this precinct, and we wait for backup. They'll come. They have to." But even as he spoke, the officer's voice lacked conviction. He too could feel the change in the air. He knew that the people outside were no longer afraid of the system. They were ready to tear it down, brick by brick. The chief's eyes flicked toward the window, where he could see the mass of people gathering outside. The protesters were no longer an unorganized mob. They were an army of citizens who had had enough. Their faces, full of anger and determination, stared up at him as if they could see through the walls. They knew what he had done. They knew the suffering his decisions had caused. The chief's grip tightened around his desk as he struggled to hold on to the remnants of his power. He had been the protector, the one who kept the peace. But now, as the chaos swirled around him, he realized that he had become the enemy. The badge he wore, once a symbol of authority and respect, now seemed to mock him. It was a symbol of his failure. Outside, the protesters were growing bolder. The chants had turned into calls for action, and the air was thick with anticipation. The old man stood at the front of the crowd, his gaze unwavering as he watched the faces of the people around him. They had come together for one purpose: to reclaim their city, to take back the power that had been stolen from them by those who had abused it. The officers inside the precinct were no longer the only ones facing danger. The chief, too, had become a target. The people had made their decision. He had to go. They had seen through the lies, through the corruption, and now they were ready to take their city back. But the old man knew that this wasn't just about taking down the chief. It was about more than that. This was about changing the very system that had allowed men like him to rise to power. This was about ensuring that no one, ever again, could stand in front of a badge and use it as a weapon to hurt the people they were supposed to protect. He turned to one of his allies, a young woman who had been organizing the protests. "This is it," he said. "We're not just tearing down the chief, we're tearing down the system." The young woman nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "We're ready. This ends tonight." Inside the precinct, the tension had reached its peak. The officers were nervously watching the crowd outside, unsure of what would happen next. They had heard the stories, seen the news reports. They knew that the chief's time was running out. But even now, there were some who were reluctant to take a stand. They had been part of the system for too long. They had seen too much to believe that change was possible. But change had already begun. The question was no longer whether they would accept it. It was whether they would fight for it. The old man stepped forward, the crowd behind him parting as he walked toward the entrance of the precinct. The officers who stood guard didn't stop him. They didn't even raise their weapons. They were no longer sure of their place in this world. The time for force had passed. He stood in front of the doors, staring up at the building that had been the center of so much power, so much pain. The walls of this building had seen the worst of humanity, but they had also witnessed the rise of something else, the rise of the people. The people who had been forgotten, who had been ignored, were now standing at the gates of power, demanding that the doors be opened. And as the old man turned back to face the crowd, his eyes filled with the weight of everything that had led them here, he knew this was the moment when the city would decide what it wanted to be. The doors to the precinct finally swung open, and the old man stepped inside. He wasn't alone. Behind him, the protesters followed, their faces filled with purpose. They had come to reclaim the city, not with violence, but with the strength of their convictions. They had come to show that the system could be rebuilt, that there was still hope for a future built on justice, equality, and truth. And as they moved forward, they knew that they were no longer just taking down the chief. They were taking down the walls that had kept them apart, the walls that had allowed corruption and power to flourish unchecked. They were taking back their city, one step at a time. The city was on the edge of transformation, no longer a place of fear and silence, but of voices rising, of faces that had once been ignored finally standing at the forefront, demanding to be heard. The old man had lived through countless battles, seen systems crumble and people torn apart by the very forces they once trusted. But this moment felt different. The air was thick with change, and yet, beneath that change, was an undercurrent of something darker: fear, uncertainty, and a deep desire for justice that could no longer be denied. Inside the precinct, the chief was standing alone in his office, his back to the door. He had been pacing for hours, his mind a whirlwind of panic and frustration. His once steady hands, which had so easily gripped the reins of power, now trembled. The world outside had turned against him, and there was no place left for him to hide. His grip on the city was slipping through his fingers, and he knew it. His officers, once loyal to him, once seeing him as a protector, were beginning to waver. They were starting to ask questions, to wonder if they had been complicit in something much darker than they had ever imagined. Some had quietly joined the protests, standing with the people, while others, too afraid to speak up, watched in silence. But none of them could ignore the fact that the city was changing, and with that change, the system they had worked for, had fought to preserve, was crumbling. The chief's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Without waiting for permission, the door creaked open, and one of his senior officers stepped inside, his face drawn with fatigue and concern. "Sir," the officer began hesitantly, "we've received reports that the protesters have begun to march on this precinct. They're not just in the streets anymore. They're headed straight for us." The chief spun around, his eyes wild. "What do you mean they're marching on us? We control this city. They can't just come here and—" "They've had enough, sir. And it's not just the protesters. There are others, officers who were once loyal to you, who are refusing to take action. Some of them are even helping the protesters." The chief's heart sank. He had expected resistance from the people, but from his own officers. That was a betrayal he had never anticipated. "Betrayal," he muttered to himself. "This is all falling apart." The officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the door. "What should we do? We can't hold them off forever." The chief paused, staring out the window. He could see the distant mass of people approaching. They were unified, determined, and it was clear they would not be swayed. In that moment, the chief realized just how far he had fallen. The power he had wielded so effortlessly, the control he had exercised over the city, was no longer enough to keep the tide from crashing against him. His mind raced. He had always relied on fear, on the idea that people would do what he told them, simply because they feared the consequences. But now, he was the one who feared. He feared the unknown. What would happen to him, to his legacy, to everything he had worked for? Would he be remembered as the man who kept the city safe, or as the man who destroyed it? Meanwhile, outside the precinct, the old man stood at the front of the crowd, his gaze fixed on the building that symbolized everything he had fought against. The officers, once his students, now stood as obstacles in his path, obstacles that had been put in place to protect a corrupt system. But the old man knew that the power had already shifted. The people had spoken. It was no longer about one man, it was about an entire city, a community, reclaiming what had been stolen from them. The people were angry, yes, but more than that, they were united. They had seen the truth. They had seen the way the system had betrayed them, the way it had ignored their cries for help, their pleas for justice. And now, they were demanding change. "We have waited long enough," the old man called out to the crowd, his voice carrying over the sea of protesters. "We have waited for justice, for accountability, for the truth to come to light. And now, the time has come to make sure that the change we have fought for becomes a reality." The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices rising in a unified chorus. The old man could feel the energy in the air, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was it, the final stand. It wasn't just about taking down one corrupt leader. It was about dismantling the system that had allowed that corruption to exist in the first place. It was about rebuilding a city where every voice mattered, where no one was above the law. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder in the distance, but the old man was undeterred. He had been here before. He had seen the violence, the brutality, the fear that followed every movement for change. But he had also seen the resilience of the people. He had seen how they could rise, how they could fight, and how they could win. He turned to the young woman who had been helping to organize the protests. Her eyes were filled with resolve, and there was no doubt in her voice when she spoke. "We've come too far to turn back now. Let's finish this. Let's take back our city." Inside the precinct, the chief was pacing again, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The officers under his command were no longer his allies. They were potential threats. Those who had once stood with him now seemed distant, unwilling to carry out the orders he barked at them. There was a subtle shift in the air, a shift that he had ignored for too long. He had believed in his power, in the control he wielded, but now, in the face of overwhelming opposition, that control seemed illusory. He clenched his fists. "They can't win," he whispered to himself. "I won't let them." But as he spoke the words, doubt crept into his mind. He knew, deep down, that the battle was lost. The people had found their voice, and that voice could not be silenced. The chief was no longer the one in control. He had lost the battle for the city, and soon he would lose everything he had worked to build. The first clash came just after dusk. The protesters, now gathered outside the precinct in a massive crowd, surged forward. The officers on the front lines hesitated, unsure of whether to push back or let the people pass. There was no clear order anymore, only confusion and fear. Some officers raised their weapons, others lowered them. The indecision was palpable, and the crowd could feel it. This wasn't just a standoff. It was the final moment of reckoning. The old man stepped forward, his hand raised to signal the crowd to stop. "This is not a fight," he said, his voice calm yet commanding. "This is a movement. We are not here to destroy. We are here to rebuild. We are here to reclaim what is ours." The crowd fell silent, waiting for the next move. The officers, caught between duty and a sense of moral obligation, hesitated. They could see the humanity in the people they were facing, the same humanity they had once sworn to protect. And in that moment, something shifted. One by one, the officers began to lower their weapons. It wasn't a surrender. It was a realization. They too had been part of the problem. They had stood by and watched as the system they were supposed to uphold had crushed the very people they had been trained to protect. The old man turned to face the precinct. "This is not just about one man," he said, his voice carrying through the streets. "This is about all of us. It's about making sure that justice is real, not just a word we use to cover up our failures." The chief stood in his office, watching from the window. His city, his world, was unraveling. The power he had once commanded had slipped away, and now it was in the hands of the people. They had spoken, and there was no turning back. As the night drew on, the sound of sirens faded into the distance. The precinct remained standing, but the system it had upheld was shattered. The old man had seen it all, the lies, the corruption, the betrayal. But he had also seen the people rise, and he had seen them win. The city was no longer a place of fear. It was a place of possibility. The reckoning had come, and the people had shown that they would never again be silenced. The night had fallen heavy over the city, but there was a flicker of something else in the air. Hope. It wasn't a loud, defiant roar or a cry of victory. It was quiet, almost reverent, the kind of hope that settled in the bones after years of struggle, after countless moments of doubt and loss. It was the kind of hope that came when people finally realized they had the power to shape their future, to rebuild a broken world. The streets, once filled with anger and resentment, were now filled with something else, a sense of possibility. The old man stood at the heart of the city, watching as people from all walks of life gathered together. They were tired, worn down from the battle, but there was something different in their eyes. They had seen what was possible when they stood together, when they refused to accept the status quo any longer. The chief was gone, his hold on the city shattered. The precinct, once the fortress of corruption, stood silent now, a monument to a past that was no longer relevant. The old man knew that the work wasn't done. There was still much to be done, rebuilding the institutions, ensuring that the mistakes of the past wouldn't be repeated. But tonight, the people could breathe a little easier. Tonight, they had won. Inside the now empty precinct, the old man stood before the desk where the chief had once sat. It felt surreal, standing in this space that had held so much power, so much pain. But it was empty now. The chief was gone, and the city was ready to rebuild. The walls had witnessed so many lies, so much injustice, but now they would stand as witnesses to something else. A new beginning. The old man ran his fingers over the surface of the desk, tracing the worn edges of the wood. He had spent so many years fighting against the very system that this desk represented. But now, the desk itself felt like a symbol of change, a reminder that even the most entrenched power could be dismantled when the people united. The door creaked behind him, and he turned to see the young officer who had come to him for advice standing in the doorway. His face was lined with the exhaustion of the battle they had just fought, but there was a light in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He had chosen his side, and now he stood alongside the people, ready to rebuild. "Is it over?" the officer asked, his voice soft. The old man nodded slowly. "It's never really over, but we've taken the first step. The rest is up to them." The officer stepped into the room, his gaze sweeping over the now empty precinct. "I never thought I'd see this day. I never thought we'd get here." The old man's eyes softened as he looked at the officer. "We've always been here. It's just that, for too long, you couldn't see it. Now, you can. Now, we all can." The officer paused, his voice filled with an emotion that the old man hadn't expected. "I'm sorry. I wish I had known earlier. I wish I had seen it sooner." The old man placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm but reassuring. "You didn't know, but now you do, and that's enough. You're here now. That's what matters. Outside, the city was alive with activity. The streets were filled with people who had once been silenced, now finding their voices again. They were gathering in small groups, speaking to one another, sharing their stories of loss and survival, of hope and despair. It was a mosaic of emotions, each piece a reflection of the struggles they had endured. The old man watched as the people moved through the streets, their faces full of determination. They were not just fighting against the past. They were fighting for a future where everyone had a voice, a future where power was no longer concentrated in the hands of the few, but shared by the many. The sun began to rise, casting a soft light over the city. It wasn't a dramatic sunrise. It wasn't the kind of light that announced an epic victory. It was subtle, almost humble, as if the world itself was taking a deep breath after the storm had passed. And in that moment, the old man realized that this was the true meaning of victory. It wasn't about overthrowing one man, one system. It was about something deeper. It was about the people reclaiming their power, not through violence or vengeance, but through unity and the belief that they deserved better. The old man had spent his life fighting against an unjust system, but now he saw the seed of something new taking root in the hearts of the people. The young officer stepped up beside him, his eyes on the horizon. "Do you think it will work? Do you think we can change things for real?" The old man looked at him, a faint smile on his lips. "I don't know, but I do know that they've made the first step. And that's all that matters. Change doesn't come in a single moment. It comes when people keep pushing, when they keep demanding more. And I've seen enough today to know that they will." The officer nodded slowly, the weight of the words settling over him. "I hope you're right." "I don't hope," the old man replied. "I know." As the day unfolded, the old man walked through the streets, watching as the city began to transform. The protests had ended, but the work was just beginning. People were meeting in community centers, in parks, in their homes. They were discussing what had happened, what they had learned, and what they needed to do next. It was the kind of conversation that should have been happening for years, but it was only now, in the aftermath of the battle, that they were truly listening to each other. The old man knew that the real work had only just begun. There were still those who would try to maintain the status quo, still those who would fight to hold on to power. But now, there were more people ready to stand against them, and that was enough. The sun was setting, casting the city in a golden glow. The old man stood on the steps of the building that had once been a symbol of oppression, now a symbol of the fight for change. The young officer stood beside him, his expression thoughtful. "You know," the officer said quietly, "I never imagined it would be like this. I thought it would be about something bigger, something grander. But now I see it. It's about the people. It's about all of us." The old man smiled, his eyes distant as he watched the people of the city moving through the streets, no longer afraid, no longer silenced. "Yes, it always has been. It's just that now, they know it too." The officer stood beside him in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on them both. This wasn't the end of their journey. It was only the beginning. But as they stood there, watching the city come to life, the old man knew that the fight had been worth it. For the first time in years, he believed that change was possible. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, he knew that the future would be in the hands of those who had dared to dream of something better. The dawn had come, and it was theirs to shape. Thank you for following this journey with us. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. What did you think of the characters, the conflicts, and the changes they faced? Have you ever encountered similar experiences in your own life, or seen moments of injustice that shaped who you are today? Your experiences and feedback are incredibly important to us, and we truly value each and every one of you. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Your support means the world to us. Wishing you all a wonderful day ahead. And to let us know you've listened to the end, Leave a comment with the phrase, "The power to change is in our hands." Thank you again for being part of this journey.